Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and especially we do gonna discuss about the poverty and hunger reduction. According to World Bank, like now for the COVID situation, 150 million people they go for under poverty line, especially for the developing nations. We have our strong panelist from Europe and from USA. We have Dr. William, we have Professor Donald, we have my friends from Mr. Hendrik from Sweden. We have our new friend. He gonna introduce herself today with our audience, and we have our energetic panelist, Mr. Alex. So I want to start with my new panelist. She can introduce herself. She was a really excellent guest for me. She communicated with me, and she said that yes, she can contribute for World Talent Economy Forum. Welcome, World Talent Economy Forum, and ma'am, can you please introduce yourself with our audience?
Hi, thank you. My name is Annie Bohuler, and I have been working in the regenerative ag industry and on farms in the birthplace of the organic farm movement around Monterey Bay for the last 10 years. And recently doing research around the connection between psychology and the regenerative ag movement and the physiological response and lack of response from individuals, especially in the United States and our specific culture around the climate emergency. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to start the discussion for today, especially poverty and hunger reduction strategy we want in COVID-19 periods. I want to start with Dr. William. He is policy consultant, and he has a huge experience in policy, politics, as well as in social organization. Sir, my question is that what will be the best strategy for COVID-19 periods for reducing these poverty lines? And what will be the best strategy we can take right now?
Okay, well, to begin with, as we all know, poverty is a very large area, and it seems to be intractable. But there's a thought I have about that in a moment. But right now, what we need to understand is that we've seen a spike in the relative poverty levels because of the pandemic. And the first things that we can do is getting the economies back in order. And what that means is getting the American economy stabilized and running again, which is the engine of the world economy moving again. What that will then do is, and it's not a perfect solution, and I want to be upfront and clear to the audience, and as those that hold the capital around the world, they already know. At best, what we can do is we can try to, in the short term, return the world to the status quo prior to the pandemic, which includes the then pre-existing economic inequalities that existed across the globe. I guess what you're asking is a two-part thing. One, how did we get back to where we were to start with? And then, once we're back at square one, how do we then move further to ultimately make progress to reduce world pandemic poverty? And so the first thing would be to fix the world's economies, which are still shaky, although the advent and the approval of the vaccines is, I would argue or assert, one of the best starts that we can make.
Okay, thank you, sir. Professor Donalds, how do you want to add this strategy specifically for poverty reductions and hunger reduction strategy, and how you want to share your experience with us?
Well, as Dr. Williams said, it's complicated and multifaceted. There's many people, 150 million, I think, is what the World Bank says, who are poor and hungry anyway because of the main reason that they're poor and hungry is because of conflict, wars. And so it messes up their food production chains, like trying to get the food to people. And even there is enough food in the world to feed everybody. The problem is getting the food to the people who actually need it. And wars and corrupt governments disrupt those supply chains, so you can't actually do it. The COVID has been disruptive, but the most disruptive person has been Trump, and he has been anti-trade. So it's this whole idea that the United States is going to go it alone. But the World Bank and Oxfam and other organizations that really do try and help with poverty and do help have been very clear that stopping food from going from one country to another has just been damaging. So one of the first things we can do, which is really simple, is to go back to the idea that we can trade goods, move goods from one place to another. And the United States isn't immune to this. The United States has at least 50 million people with food insecurity. And there's a lot of things that we can do about that, local agriculture, but it's a matter of will. It's a matter of the United States feeling some sort of obligation to the rest of the world to try and make things better. And not just the United States, the developed world. How we can end these conflicts and make the world a more peaceful place has been an issue since the beginning of humans. But there's a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he shows that overall the world is getting more peaceful. And I think that's the main thing. It's been that way before, and it's been that way since. But COVID has made this. The America First policy has made, and Brexit have made the world a less communication with the world and less movement of goods. And then COVID made it a lot worse. So from a policy standpoint, getting back to some degree of free trade would be the number one thing we need to do.
Thank you, Professor Donald. We have our two young panelists, Mr. Enric. Yes, Mr. Enric. Yes, you can share.
I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble with my connection today.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Probably did not hear everything.
Understand.
But
yes, you can share. I know that you have NGO. You are working with different developing nations, especially for reducing poverty and for educations, new science and technology. You are supporting many developing nations countries. So how do you want to share your experience? Because you have strong engagement with different developing nations right now.
If you're speaking with me.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, because I did not hear anything. I was in the black right now.
Okay.
I mean, the entire screen went down, but I think it's just a bad internet connection generally in this town today because of a snowstorm that is ongoing outside. Anyway, something is popular, but everyone is knowing that I am right. And that is that when we built our current civilization, we built it without understanding really how the environment works, how food soils work, really at that scale. We did not understand how the climate works either and similar. So a lot of the wealth we are creating today, and today the mainstream idea how to create wealth is to create economic growth. Economic growth will increase consumption, which will drive demand, which will make people employed. So farmers could move to the cities and get jobs in industries, and they will be happy for it. And that is great. The problem is that we today are collectively using what 1.7 Earth can renew. And as our economic system is constituted today, we are not in any way incentivized us to produce and consume smarter. And the question is, would smarter production and consumption also mean a problem, especially for those who are producing and for the more poor and more vulnerable people in the world? I would say that COVID has given us an opportunity to think, what incentives do we want the world to develop with? What kind of structures do we want to foster
Mhm.
in the future? And that is that when we are thinking about the social rights of people, and that
Mhm.
is basic human dignity, that poor people should have the opportunity to eat, poor people should have the opportunity to live somewhere, should have the opportunity to have education, health care, clothes, basic needs. The other issue, which I think is equally important, is the issue of power. I think that people, where they live, in communities, should have the power over their own local resources to a greater extent than they have today. And one of the greatest problems we have today in the world is, as Professor Dodal said, parasitic centralized states,
Mhm.
which concentrate the wealth of the
I'm
nation
sorry.
into the hands of
Mhm.
people, and people.
Okay. I'm sorry that I think he has a problem with internet. Uh, Mr. Henry, can you hear me? I can give you chance more, but I want to go to Mr. Alex.
Mhm.
Uh, yes, I know that you are activist, as well as you have different contributions in developing nations. Even in your country, you are trying to develop a better ecosystem. Can you share your experience about poverty reductions and hunger reductions?
Yes, so obviously it's a global problem. It's systemic throughout our society. There's a lot of solutions, and unfortunately, with the pandemic, it's causing more food insecurities and starvation in different places around the world. Especially some of my friends in Uganda and Kenya that are on lockdowns. They can't go out and work and make money, and their food insecurities are even worse because they're not able to go out and hustle and find food, scavenge for food, or do what they can to get food. So one of the ways that I like to help support food insecurities around the world is, in the past, I have donated to some of the nonprofits that are making a difference. Personally, I like supporting the World Food Program, the United Nations. USAID has done amazing things around the world. And if you've watched some of these videos, you've seen that I've been into other countries, a lot of developing countries, after major disasters, after multiple major hurricanes, earthquakes, civil unrest, and so on. And I have seen USAID right there with the United States military distributing aid. I've seen the World Food Program right on the front lines, Save Our Children. So there are a lot of governmental and non-governmental organizations that have the ability to get into regions that most people can't, especially in war-torn areas or major disasters. So I like supporting them. It does help stabilize some of the regions with food. There's a lot of ways that we could all strengthen our food resilience and just grow our own food. So it doesn't really matter if we have a couple pots on our patio, or if we start a small garden, or we eventually start creating a larger garden, network with other people, create a community garden, participate in a community garden, support your local farmers markets. There's a lot of ways that we can bring it back locally. All of this, again, just has to do with education, just taking the individual initiative, going online, researching how to grow food, start some seeds and start off small and eventually expand. This is a lifelong skill that you're going to use and utilize throughout your life, and we will continue to see more food insecurities around the world as we continue to see ecosystem collapses, as well as hurricanes continue to happen, not only like larger in size, larger in velocity, they happen more frequently and even simultaneously. So when we start seeing more hurricanes or forest fires, droughts in different regions because of climate change, they will become larger. So we won't be as resilient in certain areas. Basically, larger areas will be affected, and we're going to continue to have to help one another, support one another to get food and water resources into the areas that need it. One of the last programs we did talk about water resources, and there's a huge correlation in between, obviously, water and the food that we can grow. One of the topics that was not mentioned at all in our last discussion is gray water. Of course, I would love to have done more research on gray water, but as long as you're not consuming a lot of pharmaceuticals and you dumping a lot of chemicals down your drains, you can use gray water to water all your plants. I know they do that a lot in my community, how they capture gray water. So that's something to learn about. I have taken multiple courses in agriculture, and I had a hydroponic system set up at one point. It was wonderful. I grew a lot of tomatoes all year long in a greenhouse that I had. I also had an aquaponic system set up. I think hydroponics and aquaponics will continue to be the direction that we go as we continue to see disasters and fluctuations in the climate. It allows us to become more resilient. So I'm also a strong supporter of organic food and organic food production. That allows us to grow food and sustainably. If we continue to dump chemicals and fertilizers and synthetic everything onto the food that we're growing, not only does it destroy our bodies, it's depleting the soils around the world. So then we're not only dependent on all those fossil fuel derived synthetic fertilizers, then if we choose to go organic, it's just horrible. So I try to support organic food so we can continue to build Earth's biomass. It also helps with carbon sequestration and all of the Annie might go more into this because that's what she specializes in. It's really cool. So that has to do with sustainability, ecosystems. I covered some of the main things that I wanted to possibly touch upon in this conversation.
Thank you. Dr. William, do you want to add something? Yes.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is I'd like to refer to our new guest, Ani. And then I guess I did have a point that I wanted to touch upon that I think coincides with what Professor Donald was talking about. But certainly, I want to defer first. Ani, sorry.
Yes.
Thanks. Well, I guess I'll just respond to a couple of things that have already been said. I do think that, getting back to where we were before and being able to get aid to the places that are facing famine in the extreme ways is definitely necessary. I also think that as we've moved as a globe more and more into globalization, I don't think that that's necessarily sustainable because we are past peak oil. We need to localize everything. So I see that as a stepping stone. Also, our federal budget for humanitarian aid is like 0.8% compared to 15.8% for national defense. So I think there's a value system that needs to change, at least in the United States, where we're somewhat buffered. Although there are plenty of people facing famine and poverty in this country, overall, in the US, people are mostly buffered from hitting those lower points that trigger change in people's behavior. So there needs to be a value shift in thinking of, as was mentioned before, like people having their basic needs met and having their dignity and having care for our human race being, thinking of that as national offense and having that be a priority. So although I do agree because of Brexit and certain other things that Trump has done that he's worsened things, I also appreciate troops being taken out of the Middle East, as most of our foreign aid goes to Israel, Afghanistan, and the Middle East in general. So I do think that the methodologies of permaculture and indigenous knowledge can solve a lot of our issues, especially because it's place specific. So whatever your bioregion is, and then whatever the projections are for how the zoning, like the freeze time and the highest temperatures in that region are, they're going to shift. If we take those things into account, talking to biologists and other horticulturists about what are the plants, perennials. We need to have agriculture be more focused on perennials. We need intercropping, polycropping as opposed to monocropping. The whole Central Valley of California growing almonds, where so much of the water is misused in the larger corporate farms in Central Valley, California, because they're not polycropping. We're wasting water, and we are not planting the plants that need to be there for how the climate's changing into the future. So no-till farming, every season or 4 times a year, depending on where you are, a farmer tills the soil. Same issues that led to the Dust Bowl, and we are still farming in this way. That's releasing carbon every time. It's destroying the biome in the soil. It's destroying the fungus. It is not how nature works. And although it is how we can industrialize and have everything on a larger scale, which we still need to keep that large scale production up to some degree, we have to find a middle ground of how we can incorporate no-till farming and perennial agriculture into a larger scale. And those things are possible. We need to have the old school farmers and like the farmers that have control over such vast amounts of land be communicating with these more maybe progressive farmers with newer ideas that are adaptive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. William.
Yes, and I appreciate that. I guess, Donald, at the risk of, picking a disagreement, I understand certainly all of those issues, but it seems to me at the end of the day, all of this stuff comes down to money. And Professor Donald, you're absolutely right with regard to free trade. And I understand that people are opposed to globalization, and that the solutions are more regionally based and or say geographic based where you are in the world and the conditions. But those are all inputs in order to get to the root of at least feeding or solving short-term poverty and short-term hunger. However, it seems to me, as an observation, it's certainly one that I would advocate, and that is a long-term. And Donald, you ready? I think we need, I think fundamentally, rather than the culture change, is not this one-time giving or donation or approaching it to see if we can solve the immediate need or the problem. It's rather a long-term structural shift. And that shift is one of this. That is complete debt relief for those in the third world countries, the countries that need it the most, provided that they will then utilize that economic windfall to then incorporate some of the newer ideas with regard to smart farming, agriculture, or job creation. So that would be either debt relief, debt forgiveness, or dare I say it, debt forgiveness within a larger package of reparations. So to the extent that we start talking about this issue, we can't continue to talk about it within the confines of the old paradigm. And quite frankly, here's the old paradigm. The old paradigm was that previous countries, including the United States, but from around the world, because everybody's guilty at various points of time, they went into resource-rich countries, and through what Enrique said, those parasitic centralized governments or corporations, it doesn't really matter. They went in, they stole the resources, enriched themselves, and then left. Now, the point here is that aren't those countries economically due some reparations? Now, in the meantime, the past thought process was simply, oh, okay, well, we feel bad for what our forefathers did, and sorry about that, so we're going to loan you money provided you listen to our experts about restructuring your economy, except that they can't understand our experts because our experts don't work for their economy. And so they try to implement these changes in exchange for desperately needed money, which is more like blackmail. If you just want to put it frankly, it's economic blackmail because you've got countries without money that need the money. You got a bunch of people from the outside, dare I say white people, telling a bunch of people of color, saying, okay, well, this is how you have to run your economy. They're like, okay, give me the money. You give them the money. They say, okay, we're going to try to do it the way you guys want us to do it out of these policy manuals. And then they can't do it. And so then they need more money. So there's this ever cascading, self-perpetuating cycle of endemic, systemic, disparate economic justice. Now, the only way that you can do that is to say, okay, listen, let's just put a stop to it. Let's give them economic reparations in recognition of everything that was done to them in the past, as the world can certainly afford it, to call it relief, call it forgiveness, call it reparations, start with a clean slate. And then at that point, once we've alleviated their need that they have to constantly damage the environment in order to pay off these loans, which they will never, ever, ever be able to pay off, maybe then we can start with incorporating some of these other ideas. But until they either get economic relief from the money that they have to pay back currently, they will never, ever adopt any kind of policy. For them, it'll just be a small slice of their community on the progressive wing of whatever their community is saying, these are great ideas, but it'll never be implemented. Debt forgiveness, reparations. Donald, did I start it off?
Professor Donald. Yes, Professor Donald.
Yeah, there has been discussion of that. I want to point out that I don't remember how many years, but it's just a few, that there's going to be another 2 billion people on Earth, and where even in the rich countries, there's pressure on the food supply. We had a huge storm in the Midwest this year that destroyed some significant portion of the wheat crop and soy crop, the kind of stuff they grow in the Midwest. This year, Africa had the worst locust storm that they've had in generations, and it destroyed a lot of their foods. And when you get to someplace like Syria, the drought that they had several years ago was so bad that the farmers had to leave the land and move to the cities, and that created such an imbalance that it started a civil war that's still going. So right now, sub-Saharan Africa is dependent on food from the rest of the world. If they don't get food from the rest of the world, they die. And I've just been looking at, preparing for this. I was looking at the World Food Program from the United Nations, and they're very clear that the biggest problem is getting the stuff to them right now. I know there's been talk about lifting the debt, and I think that's a great idea. That'll help them. But right now, some places just don't have land to grow stuff on, and I don't know what we can do about that.
Hydroponics,
okay.
Indoor.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Hendrik, I think we missed your discussion. Yeah.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Good. The idea food in the world and food nutrients. 1/3 of the soils in the earth, in the planet, are depleted. And this is especially true in countries like China, India, Southern Europe, parts of Central Europe, and actually like the in the mid United States used to be 5 meters deep back in the early 19th century. Today it is around 30 centimeters deep, which shows that a combination of over harvesting massive amounts of fertilizers, and that you use a lot of of groundwater to big cities. That is not a very sustainable strategy. Soil regeneration to communities and help to implement that, and actually do a rotation schedule on a local level. Regarding food and sub-Saharan Africa, there is also a structural problem as well there, because I mentioned China. Large parts of China are turning into urban development zones, large parts are turning into desert. And China is also restoring a lot of areas, that should not be denied, but it's a question of scale. China is importing food from Africa today by very lucrative trade deals with African nations. So the local elites in countries in Eastern Africa are winning very much on these deals, but the people are getting more expensive food because the Chinese have more money and are willing to pay more for the food. And the economies of the cash crops. And cash crops are also one of the biggest environmental problems in the earth after climate change, and one of the reasons for biodiversity loss of pollinating insects. So we have to look at empowering communities and to let communities control more of their own local land, as well as giving them the intellectual tools to manage and restore their soils.
Okay, Mr. Alex, like if you share a few of your practical experience as well as your project with our audience, I think it will be really helpful for us. Actually, both Mr. Alex as well as Annie, I want some of your practical experience. Yes.
Okay.
Especially for agriculture.
Okay. Yes, no problem. So I did just want to touch upon what Enrique was saying. He was mentioning depleting Earth's soil, and that's happening because we're dumping so many synthetic fertilizers and chemicals on it. So again, that has to do with carbon sequestration, so it doesn't hold as much carbon, and that's adding to global warming. So one of the ways to solve that globally is just to try to compost more. So whether you're a small business, a small company doing some sort of food production, or you're a family or a single person living by yourself, just composting, hopefully buying organic food and then incorporating that compost material back into the soil, maybe in a planter in your yard. That's helping. If we all did that globally, it'd be a huge solution instead of taking all that composting material and taking it to the landfills. So I'm a strong supporter of composting and different sustainable methods of taking compostable material and reintroducing it into the soil instead of continuing to be dependent on genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and all these synthetic fertilizers. So Annie mentioned a really important word. It's called permaculture. She might want to go into more detail regarding it. So it's basically like growing stuff sustainably. It's like using a system. So at my house in Boulder Creek 3 years ago, I had a almost complete permaculture system. I had my cargo shipping container with solar panels on the roof. Outside of my house where I lived, it was like a project I was doing. So I had solar panels, a solar hot water heater, I had a water tank. Next to that, I was had chickens for eggs. I had some rabbits. I was doing some breeding and selling them. So that was part of the system using the rabbit pellets. I had my aquaponics system that was growing food, and it grew everything for so long. I just had some timers on it. It like ran itself, and I would just harvest lettuce from these trays, which was on an ebb and flow system. And then I had my worm bin, so I was making composting teas with this bubbler and everything else that I had. And then I had my compost bin. Next to my house, I created a greenhouse, and I had a hydroponic system. I was dependent from the farm store for purchasing organic liquid fertilizer for my hydroponic system, and I was also dependent on giving the chickens food to supplement when I wasn't able to give them my vegetable scraps. And I was trying to go to the farmers market, so I had this whole like permaculture system where I would take some of this organic matter, bring it over here, and I'd move everything around, and I was able to grow a lot of food. It was really fun. I have a lot of pictures. Hopefully I can share at some point. Just my whole setup. And I was going to take that and move it onto a property and be sustainable, but then I started traveling the world trying to help people. So Annie mentioned polycrop or polycropping and monocropping. So this is an important key term I think some of our audience should know. So monocropping is basically where you grow like dozens of miles or thousands of square miles of just corn. It's like all one crop or all wheat. And what happens is it disrupts the ecosystem and all the insects and everything. So there's different ways to incorporate different plants, and we're starting to see this in different places around the world because farmers are starting to see the benefits. So you can grow different rows of plants with each other, and some of them might be good at keeping deer away from eating your plants. Some might be good at keeping insects away. And some of them are nitrogen producing, such as fava beans. So there's different ways you can incorporate crops together, but still do large scale farming projects. So I wanted to mention one of the things that we all should do, and I hope everyone hears me, like right now is a really good time to plant fruit trees. Like, I don't know why the cities just keep planting these trees for looks. Like, we need to be planting fruit trees. It might not be good for the economy, I don't know, because then we're not like going to the store buying stuff. It would allow us to be more resilient. It would allow the homeless people to be able to like eat when they're starving. It would allow us to, if we're in between paychecks, we can go at least get some apples and oranges. I have seen this in some countries, but it's not enough. I don't know why our governments and local communities aren't doing more of that. Drew Glover, that was on the Santa Cruz City Council where I live, he had such a hard time creating this small little food forest of like 20 trees, and he was on the council. Like, everybody was fighting him to do this. So I just think that there's so many different trees in different regions that might be good. Thankfully, like if you go to Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, some of the places I've been to, there's already food growing on trees. But like my community, it's a Mediterranean climate, and there's no reason we shouldn't be doing that on the city streets. I just think there's a lot of advantages. And of course, they would be organic and not like GMO crossed, whatever types trees. So another huge subject when it comes to food securities is like not wasting food. Like America, it's disgusting. I'm embarrassed that I live in America and all the gluttony and the greed and how much food people waste. And it's not just the homeowner, the family, it's the businesses, the corporations, all these restaurants, they just waste so much food. All of that food takes energy, and that's part of the reason why we're going through anthropogenic global warming. It takes water, resources, time, energy, and fossil fuels to grow food, even if it's organic, to transport it and all of that. So when we waste food, we're wasting energy, we're wasting resources, and it's just like morally wrong. Like, I hardly never waste food. I hate wasting food. So I eat my leftovers before I make new food, and I conserve. And thankfully I have free-range organic chickens right now, and sometimes when I have leftover food, I feed it to my chickens. So wasting food is a horrible problem. I think it would help a lot. Kiva.com, that's where, if you have the ability to donate, you can donate to the families in developing countries, and they can build their own farm. Then they could be sustainable and more less dependent on the government and potential stimulus or United Nations, World Food Program, USAID coming in and helping them so they can start their own farmer business. Wiping out debt, I thought, was a good idea because so many countries owe other countries money, and seems like it would be a good solution. So the transportation system is why it would be so great if we started buying local and shopping local and become more self-sufficient, because it doesn't matter if you're transporting it from electric vehicles or diesel trucks, it still uses fossil fuels. So if we buy local and what's in season, it does help with everything. So with what Donald was saying, it just reminded me that we can grow food in different regions around the world, but we use greenhouses. Now, I don't know how much of a supporter I am of greenhouses because a lot of them are made with plastic, but if it's a sustainable greenhouse, and you get more food from it than the environmental impact and carbon footprint that it initially takes to create the greenhouse, then I'm okay with it. So I think greenhouses would help provide food and food security in places around the world. There's so many great greenhouse designs. Thankfully, where I live, there's a community college that actually has a course on greenhouse production, building your own greenhouse. So those are some of the key subjects that I wanted to touch on. Oh, one more thing. Other administrations in the past have directed more attention towards the United Nations World Food Program, the programs I'm talking about, specifically USAID. And under the Trump administration, it just didn't seem like he was going in and helping regions around the world. As the United States is a global superpower, and we have such a high GDP, and we have all these resources in abundance, and we waste so much food, and such a small percentage of our money goes towards programs. I hope this new administration continues to direct a larger portion towards USAID, and they can get into some of the regions that are going through extreme hardships. Nothing compared to what we're seeing here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Annie. How do you want to add your agriculture expertise at present situations?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to respond to a couple of things that were just said. I appreciate Enrique focusing on the local communities. I also just want to say that I think all of these are answers. We have to address such a large global issue from that perspective of globalization and changing policy, and considering the fact that we have this world trade system, and we also have to address things locally on every single level. We can address this. When regions in the United States were originally being divided for the boundaries of cities and states, watersheds were not considered, and considering your watershed is how we should be considering ourselves in a region.
Wow.
And so I think just shifting our mindset around where we actually are in place, and that is in relevancy to our watersheds. And I think that is an important piece for a mindset shift, although I don't see that actually changing policy necessarily. But like Alex was saying, with implementing local foods and just like planting trees that could feed people who do live outside, there's so much bureaucracy and so much energy that has to go into shifting policy because of our value system, that it takes years for someone to even be able to plant a couple fruit trees on public land, because the mess that the fruit would create, or whatever the reasons are that people come up with to not feed people. There's lots of reasons, it's amazingly enough, that people come up with to not feed people in local cities. So Seattle was the first. Seattle was the first city in the United States to make a large public food forest in their downtown park, and it took a lot of years for them to be able to do that because of all the backlash. Who's going to take care of it? Who gets to eat this food? How are we going to make sure it's distributed fairly? All of these reasons. So I think Seattle food forest is something that should be modeled, and that should be the status quo shift. Every city should have a policy like Atlanta was to follow. Atlanta just in the past few years has designated over 7 acres in their inner city to be a food forest. And they are shifting their policy around trying to get as many people in the Atlanta greater area, Atlanta, Georgia, to be getting their food from within 100 miles. And since that's a goal, within 100 miles, at least 50 to 75% of everybody's calories, then that policy can have a ripple effect. Okay, we're going to support local farmers. There's going to be policy shift around that. We're going to implement a 7-acre food forest and all of these other policies that follow from that. So as much as we want to empower local people to do these things in their own home space, There's a lot of people out there who are not going to until it's forced. We have to compost. It needs to be not an option. Methane is like one of the worst greenhouse gases, and most of it does come from cattle, and also not composting all of that organic matter in the landfills. So those things need to be shifted on a policy level, I think. And there's one more thing I want to say. I think it's really important for this to be incorporated, because there's just a lot of people out in the world like wanting things to go back to normal because of COVID. And I think it's important to consider that we might look back on 2020 in a few years and be like, that was just the beginning. Like viruses, bacteria, fungus, these organisms that have short lifespans, they evolve quickly. And so as climate's changing, as certain regions are exposed to temperatures that they haven't been exposed to, plants and animals don't have immunity for these things as they evolve super quickly. It's probably just going to get worse. And so we need to be shifting our mindset and be able to adapt even faster to this, because we might look back and go, okay, I wish we could go back to 2020, actually. I think that's super important. And that comes, once again, back down to values and not buffering ourselves, at least in the United States, around comfort. And I'm just going to say one more thing as like an analogy in the larger agricultural perspective. A lot of people think, okay, if I buy organic, that's the answer. Well, Driscoll's is a huge company. The whole Monterey Bay area, lots of property is owned by Driscoll's. And in the Monterey Bay, which is a marine sanctuary, most of the strawberries that are grown for the whole North America are grown in the Monterey Bay, because that's where they grow well. Also, strawberries are pretty difficult to grow. I've worked on strawberry farms. They are delicate, and they get a type of fungus really easy called verticillium. And they get verticillium because people are growing strawberries after strawberries after strawberries every year, and tons of chemicals pumped into the soil, going into the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, because people need their strawberries at any moment. And verticillium is actually killed with just one season of growing broccoli. So we just grew broccoli intermittently with strawberries, we could reduce the amount of chemicals, but that would mean people don't have strawberries at every moment, everywhere, all the time. So there's a value shift around moving towards ethnocentrism, where we are the center of the universe, towards ecocentrism, where we realize we are part of a system. And we must consider this from a moral standpoint too, and that policy of responsibility. Enrique was talking about empowering people who do have power. That comes with the responsibility. So people in the United States, if you have the ability to have the knowledge, to have access to this knowledge, that comes with the responsibility of responding to that knowledge.
Thank you, Dr. William. Very interesting point already introduced by our young panelist. Specifically, better ecosystem is important, as well as like a government has to support these ecosystems. Especially you are politicians, you have a better understanding about policy. And the climate change is very important things right now. I want to introduce one point specifically, that what I get from the developing nations, like agriculture is not a problem, specifically productions and everything is not problem. Problem is better supply chains. Farmers not getting enough price. Middleman actually taking most of the price. And like example, the consumers, they have to pay more. That is actually major problem. Even though I'm sure in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, this kind of country, everyone has same problem. And it's every year farmers losing billions and billions of dollars, only the lackings of better supply chain. The middlemen actually take most of the money. Consumers are losing money. Farmers are losing their business. So what do you want to add specifically in this point?
Okay, all right. I'm up for the challenge. Quite specifically,
Yeah.
a couple of different things. In the developing countries, most importantly, the biggest thing for them is the pressure to pay back loans. If we had debt relief or debt forgiveness, what that would do is that would free up the money that the government would have that they could then turn around and utilize for infrastructure. And that infrastructure would then lessen the cost of the transportation of goods and services and people. And therefore, that would make it harder for the middlemen to take more than their disproportionate share of the value that they add to the food production. On this point, I do want to point out that we already have an example of this, and that's the mass protests in India, with the farmers reacting and protesting and in camp around India under Modi's new deregulation policies, which essentially are freeing up the centralized corporations to double down on their efforts to overcharge, overcreate, and underpay the farmers. So it's not like it's a Rubik's Cube, because it can be solved. Although some people think Rubik's Cubes are easy, I think that they're tough. I'll never know how to figure one out. But what I can tell you is this, is that the root of it all begins with money. And to the extent
Mhm.
that you have governments whose responsibility is to do ostensibly to look out for their citizens and do make the right investments long term, both in education, social safety net, as well as various other areas that are fundamental to improving the lives of the citizens. Now, the only way they can do that is if they are not facing these inordinate debts. And I'm specifically talking about developing nations, and specifically talking to those individuals in charge in the third world countries and developing nations. And the most important thing, I think, if you surveyed any of them in a room, if you just threw a rock, you hit everybody that would say debt relief and debt forgiveness. Because once that financial burden is removed, then they would have the resources to invest and begin to address the other issues. Now, here's what I want to kind of point out. Earlier, one of our colleagues, I believe it was Enrique, said that what COVID has done is it's given us time to think about how we're approaching the issues. And that's very important. It's given us time to think. Now, at various times, it's become popularized when people have said, never let a crisis go unused. And COVID certainly has given us time to think, but it still is a crisis. And as Annie points out, this may be just the beginning or the tip of the iceberg. There are any number of things that I could cite that would say, hey, listen, it's going to get worse. But before I do that, it seems to me the central point is that what we need a consortium or a coalition of the willing. The coalition of the willing to economically address the structural imbalances. And we can do that right now. We can do that because we have a pandemic crisis. We are working on logistics and supply chain, the delivery of the medicines, the vaccines, which are going to take a number of years. We've got 4 or 5 billion people. And they're talking about just to get to 300 million Americans, it's going to take us well into next year, if not the year after. And so that means that we're going to be rebuilding all this stuff. Now, those governments aren't going to be able to build or put together a supply chain or logistics chain while they are still facing crushing economic debt. So here's the coalition of the willing, a collection of warriors to use this crisis to say, let's address one time on a massive scale. Let's really think big. Let's go in for debt forgiveness, because that fundamentally changes the playing field. Because then individual governments, when we talked earlier about localizing food production, control of land and everything else, nothing localizes or empowers people by their having independent control over their own economy and their resources. And that can be done relatively swiftly with with debt relief, debt forgiveness, and perhaps debt reparations. You get that piece done, the governments will then be able to, and it's going to depend on the government. Some governmental leaders are just going to continue to rip off their people. Others may be wise enough to see this as a one-time opportunity to really get in and focus in on the issues that our activists are so accurately and eloquently pointing out. But it seems to me, let's use the time the opportunity that we've had, the crisis that we have, and put together our coalition of willing warriors to deal with this fundamental structural change. Because, and Donald, to your point earlier, if we relieve them of the stress and pressure of the need to service loans, that will fundamentally open up free trade. And as you know, free trade leads to jobs, which leads to development, which leads to people wanting to improve their countries. It's not a Rubik's Cube. It's a little complicated, but it's not a Rubik's Cube.
Thank you. Mr. Endrick, yes, I think you want to add something. Professor Donald, I'm coming to you before that. Yeah.
There are issues here that are new for us and that which we haven't found out the perfect solutions yet, and there are no perfect solutions. All solutions must be regional and local, except for the global solutions that we all are facing. But in the case of farmers who are forced into accepting really bad prices from middlemen who bring their food to cities and sell them far more expensively, the solution is that the farmers should have the control over a large degree of their own pricing. And they can do so through either improving infrastructure, so that Bangladesh, for example, will be like Switzerland with a railway station in every village, or by the farmers organizing in one huge non-ideological farmers association, a farmers association which only exists to safeguard the interest of its members. And that incidentally is the same thing how Sweden developed a better relationship with its farmers than it previously had, because we had the same problems back in the 19th century. Sweden used actually to be one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, there were princes in India in the 1860s who sent aid to starving children in Sweden, because we had a huge starvation disaster in 1867 and 1868. So it is possible for people to organize themselves to get a better deal. It is not impossible. And my final point is that perhaps if there is better infrastructure, then there could be more middlemen. And also the peasants can together invest in the infrastructure they need. For example, creating a cooperative super chain mall to a sort of a Coop, but almost like Walmart, but a Coop that they can use to transport their own goods directly to the consumers. Even if, for example, the farmer is in northern Bangladesh and the consumers are in Dhaka. And we have to discuss how to make that sustainable. But that is incidentally how farmers did it in Sweden. Because we do have one of our largest business is a Coop that is selling food.
Okay, thank you. Professor Donalds, you are from Silicon Valley. Specifically, you know the different kind of technological innovations. So what the technological innovations you want to share specifically is for managing the supply chain management? I think this is the most important problem right now, specifically for the developing nations.
I agree. I want to say a couple of things about what other people said. I want to say, first off, I am a big fan of GMOs, and I think they're going to save us. I absolutely have no objection to GMOs. I think they're extremely valuable and extremely good. If you know how it's done, you would understand that it's not hurting anything. When I go and judge the science fair in Santa Clara every year, the kids are all, I mean, one of the things, just like people used to build paper mache volcanoes, now what the kids do is they genetically modify various organisms. one kid was saying he wants to make a chicken that glows in the dark.
Mhm.
We'll see if it works out. I want to. I know that that's controversial. I don't. I know that Alex completely disagrees with me, but what the heck? What the heck? It go. Right now, another thing that I'm saying is the United States is guilty of food waste, but half the food in the world is wasted. About half the food. And one of the things that causes it to be wasted is trade issues. Because this year we had soybeans, but we couldn't sell them to China anymore. So United States had a huge market, and because that, the farmers are all like tanked, and we've been giving them aid. So we've spent 12 billion or something like that, giving the farmers money so that they can survive Trump's trade war. And it's all good to talk about hydroponics and things like that, but you know, imagine Finland, where I used to live. It's dark, and they do grow tomatoes and cucumbers in hydroponic, but it requires a lot of water and energy, actually, for them to do it, because they don't have any light. There's no light. So they import most of their vegetables from Southern Europe, from Portugal and places like that. They can't do solar, they can't do anything because it's pitch black, and all during the winter. And then you get to places like Syria or sub-Sahara Africa, and they don't have a lot of water. Those are places that are environmental catastrophes, because apparently thousands of years ago they actually had forests. But the technology now is incredible, because what they do when they plow the strawberry fields, like Annie was saying, they actually now have lasers that keep it absolutely flat, and they talk to GPSs on satellites. So the farm equipment is getting to the point where it can be like a self-driving car. They're getting to that point. The issue is in California, 10%, half the water is used to keep the rivers flowing that we get. 40% is used for agriculture, and 10% is used for cities. So for the energy consumption, water consumption, and other things, cities are actually have less impact than being spread out and distributed. Mm-hmm. So technology's being used in a lot of different ways. Silicon Valley is not great. I did a forum like this once on water and got some real experts in, and we're not that good. That isn't one of the main things that Silicon Valley really produces, but it seems to me it's a huge opportunity, and people are backing. One of the technologies that people really talk a lot about is desalinization, which can be done by solar in many places. You just basically make a kind of greenhouse and put salt water in it, and in the sun it evaporates, and you take Joe was talking about this the other day, but the scale, it's impossible to comprehend how much water they use to grow the fruits and vegetables in California. But we're so lucky. I mean, we have like one of the best climates in the world, and there's alluvial soil everywhere because of all the giant rivers. The entire Central Valley was a lake at one point when when Europeans came here. You could row a boat from Sacramento to Bakersfield. There was so much water, and all of that over years just made sediment and sediment and sediment, so that the soil in the Central Valley is some of the very, very best in the world. And as Annie pointed out, what they're doing now is using it all to grow almonds, which take an incredible amount of water. And it goes back. I don't think that technology is going to completely save us, except technology like GMOs, which are allowing us to grow crops in places where we couldn't grow them before. And I think GMOs are the technology that's really going to make a positive difference for us.
It seems to me that all of these are really discussional points for those that are developed, those nations that are developed. And the vast majority of the people that are suffering from poverty and hunger are in developing or third world nations. And so I'm not sure that I can go into a village anywhere where in a third world nation and suggest the kinds of solutions that we're talking about here. Not that our solutions aren't worthwhile and valid and in fact important in terms of the future leading the way. It's a question, though, of how we deal with the third world problems and not necessarily the first world problems. And that, for them, is going to have to begin with freeing up resources. Because at the end of the day, I mean, they will understand it, and maybe, a significant percentage of their communities will want to adopt these kinds of things. But the first things they're going to do is they're going to look around and they're going to say, well, where is the aid to help us? And the aid invariably will come from either the International Monetary Fund and other world consortiums, the United Nations, the United States, or the European Union in various forms. And so at some point in time, they're looking for a transfer of wealth from the first world countries into the third world countries. And the question becomes, what kind of transfer of wealth are we talking about? Are we talking about the kind of transfer of wealth that is a one-time, almost ongoing giving program, like we're just donating a couple of pennies or peoples of dollars to the kettles for the Salvation Army? Or are we talking about wholesale pandemic relief in the sense of forgiveness of national loan, debt loan forgiveness and debt loan relief, so that they can then start from scratch economically and then build their countries, focusing in on the best technologies and policies that we can offer to them while they have a clean slate. You know, it's important to realize and recognize that it's never really been attempted in human history just to clearly wipe out a country's debt and say, okay, you guys can start from scratch. In the alternative, we have tried over and over again to require countries to pay back debts that the world, for whatever reason, has decided that they owe and they would not forgive. And as Donald began at the beginning of this program by suggesting that it's conflict that produces the paradigm for poverty and hunger and perhaps pandemics. And quite frankly, the tie between failure to forgive or address economic, structural, or systematic issues has produced some of the worst conflicts. It was the result of the reparations from World War I that produced the very conditions that Germany couldn't repay the financial obligations that led to World War II. However, after World War II, what did we do with the Marshall Plan? Rather than just feeding people daily, we invested, we cleared their debts, and we said, okay, structurally, you're going to start from scratch and you're going to be debt free. We're just going to give you the money and then you guys can rebuild your economy. And it's not just the Marshall Plan that we can look to see that that's the way we should build. That's how we rebuilt. And when I say we, I mean, I'm focusing in here on the United States, rebuilt the Japanese economy. That is exactly what we did for Europe after World War II. And that's because those conflicts, as Donald pointed out, were created by economic imbalances, creating conditions under which countries could not possibly repay the economic monies that the world said that they were due and owing. And hence, we find ourselves in the same place, but for different reasons. COVID has given us the time to think. It's given us the time to assess. We're facing the same problem. Is this that kind of world-changing, value-changing systemic changing that Ani and Alex are looking for, that says that we can look at this differently moving forward, and perhaps it should begin with the economic, well, a new economic analysis along the mold of how we rebuilt Europe, how we rebuilt Germany, with the Marshall Plan, or are we just going to continue to tax them? If we free up the resources, they'll free up their economies, and then people will maybe possibly have a chance to get it. But I'm hopeful. I mean, if nothing else, we'll be in the same situation 5 years from now. We'll be having the exact same conversations, except Enrique, Alex, and Ani will replace you, Sharif, Donald, and me. And then they'll be talking about economic relief. But hey, take our time.
Yes, yes. Professor Donald, I think you want to add something, right? I'm
I
coming.
want to I want to say that I agree that economic relief is incredibly valuable. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but one of the problems is these kleptocracies where they basically steal the money. When the polio eradication was going on, it couldn't be done because the money was everything was just stolen by the governments. And eventually the Rotary Club, which has people in almost every country in the world, started distributing the vaccines through networks of Rotarians. In one day, they vaccinated 150 million people in India in one day. And pretty remarkable. But if you look at the problem in Ethiopia and Eritrea, the leaders of the two countries were best friends. And then they got pissed off at each other, started a war that absolutely was ridiculous because many Eritreans lived in Ethiopia and the other way around. They kicked them out, sent them to the country. They sent the Ethiopians to Eritrea, and the leaders of those countries were buying jets from the United States for literally the whole GDP of the country. And if we forgive their debt, I don't see why they're going to clean up their act and start being.
No. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Donald, to point that out. But see, the question becomes simply this: it's fair to single out those bad actors, those nations that are bad actors, but it is not fair to paint all nations by the actions of some bad actors. So it could be true. We can just be like, okay, listen, you guys, nope, you don't qualify because you guys are dumb. Okay, here's your dumb ticket. You don't get to this. But you got these other countries where it is just patently absurd and they're never going to recover. For example, you can say, okay, you get to come in. You get to come in. So it's not like we got to do it for everybody, because I don't know that financially we could do it all at once. But just because there are a couple of people out there that are knuckleheads doesn't mean that everybody else should suffer. And that's why it seems to me it's got to be a coalition of the warriors that are willing. I don't want conscripts. I don't want people that are coming along being dragging and kicking their feet and everything else. I want those who are actually saying, give me a chance as a nation. Forgive my debt and watch what we do. Those we can help. Because once we help them, then they will be on our side so that we can then help others. And we didn't get in overnight. We're not going to get out of overnight. And quite frankly, 400 or 500 years of all the shenanigans of all of our collective forefathers around the globe created this problem. The question is, how are we going to change it now and move forward? But I totally get you, Donald. I mean, bad actors, screw them. I'm not even worried about it. I'd be the first ones to hit stamp them with a reject. I can't believe it. But
Sadly, a lot of the conflict is caused by those type of people, which is, unfortunate. But that's why Ethiopia is starving now.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. I think Mr. Enrique want to add something. Then I will go to Mr. Alex. I think he has many points to share with us. Yes, Mr. Enrique. Yes. Mr. Enrique, can you hear me? Okay, I think Mr. Alex, you start.
Sorry, Enrique. We love hearing from him, and he's an extremely intelligent person. Unfortunately, his internet connection's not good. Hopefully, in the future, we can hear more from Enrique. So, I wanted to mention a few things. So companion planting, I kind of mentioned that with monocropping. It's also important around the world to do companion planting. Companion planting is where the plants benefit each other, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. I would love to see, as Annie was saying again, food forest. It's such a cool term, such a futuristic envision for a utopia to have food forest, where you have perennials, non-perennials, you have plants, trees, bushes. Everything's organic, everything's healthy. You have a really good ecosystem in these food forests. I think it'd be amazing, and it would just be a dream to have a huge forest on 7 acres. That's just unimaginable. But I wish there was more of those. So Annie also mentioned something really cool. It's like thinking outside of the box. Hopefully this is a good. Hopefully we see this in the future in our transition towards global sustainability, transitioning into a caring society and more community, because community is so important. She mentioned something about instead of having borders, we should have watershed boundaries. That's a really interesting concept. So a watershed is actually, for those that are watching that don't know, like if a river came through this area. So it's like where all the water is collected in between mountain ranges. So the peaks of the mountain ranges are the divide between the next watershed region. So all of the watershed in the whole region comes down to different creeks and then into a large river. So that would mean everybody in that watershed region has like a moral responsibility not to pollute that watershed area, because it'll affect other members in their community, instead of that river going out into a different country or county or whatever. So that's an interesting concept. So I did want to mention that there's there's food insecurities, regardless if I'm like 97% vegan, vegetarian. There are animals that have a different environmental impact. And this is good to know when you go to vote with your money, because beef, for instance, it takes a really large volume of fossil fuels just to raise beef. It takes a lot of energy. So it takes a lot of food that you have to grow, and grain or anything that you're feeding beef, corn. So it also takes a lot of water in square footage and everything. So beef is extremely impacting on the environment, as well as the methane release. So below that you have I don't have anything. So there's like chickens. So the environmental impact of chickens is much less than beef. They take less water, less resources to grow per pound of chicken. Now, I read an interesting article regarding rabbits. Now, around the world, people are raising rabbits. Here in America, we don't, because everybody thinks that they're cute and cuddly and fluffy and it's their pet. So regardless if I'm vegan and I don't eat meat as often, and for those that do, the environmental impact of rabbit is extremely sustainable. They have more protein per pound. There's no diseases you get from rabbits. You can use their droppings, their pellets, to fertilize stuff. You could use them in permaculture systems, agriculture. I said that their protein content's really high. There's a lot of benefits versus eating rabbits compared to cows and chickens and other farm animals. So we have talked about economics in here, and recovery and jobs in some of the previous programs. So there's so many opportunities when it comes to food production, everything about food, because that's, in the past, we've lived in America too, like we buy everything that we want, not necessarily the things that we need. Everyone is going to need food. Everyone's going to need water. So if you decide to go in the career path of agriculture, permaculture, learning everything you can about how to grow food, produce food, it's not only going to give you job security in the future and help our society become sustainable, it also helps you take care of your family and friends when there are food insecurities, and you'll be the one to grow food, especially when climate change continues to disrupt places around the world. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to mention, some people are saying, in America, I hear this a lot. I say, hey, eat organic or support organic companies. And I constantly have people say, oh, how do you know it's organic, or USDA certifies organic's corrupt and I don't trust it, or they still use all these chemicals. Eating organic doesn't necessarily mean purchasing from USDA certified organic. Eating organic may be getting the lemons or the oranges from your friend's tree, or going to the farmer's market where you know that they're eating organic. At some point, it would be cool if Annie would explain this really cool word. She's told me it a couple times. It's called biodynamics. It's kind of like permaculture, kind of like eating organic, but it's better than organic. And she, I think, worked on a biodynamic farm to where everything is like beyond sustainable. It's like regenerative. It's a really cool thing that some of her farms were working on. Living roofs are starting to become mandatory in different places, I think, around California, and we'll see this more around the world. In California, I think all new building construction projects, or they're working on it, or certain counties, they either have to have solar on the roof or a living roof. And I'm already starting to see some large construction projects, and one's already completed in Santa Cruz with a living roof. That's where you have dirt, soil, trees, plants on the roof. So as we continue to learn how to become sustainable, I think living roofs and growing food on the roofs is going to be important. So I did just write down this note. A good bridge in between, being prosperous and starving here in the United States is by taxing people, and hopefully taxing the rich more, and programs such as food stamps. Now, that's something that bridges the gap in between people, not having money or between paychecks, or such as going through this pandemic. But I think if there was more socialist style programs like that in other countries where they have some sort of food credit, or there's probably a building or something that like people go to pick up food, like a charity, maybe churches and stuff. That would also be important in other countries. So there's I did want to mention there's a couple types of fertilizer. So there's a lot of stuff that's grown with synthetic fertilizers and chemicals and everything that's derived from fossil fuels and chemical processes. There's also there's biomass and different things that we fertilize, but around the world they're using sludge, and it's basically the human feces and everything else. So it was so sad. I saw this article and I thought that it was fake, and it was upsetting. It was North Korea was going through so much economic hardship and food insecurities that they made it mandatory that you had to give up a large volume of your feces and your toilet waste to grow the food in North Korea. And I thought that was fake, and I did like research, and it was just like all kinds of articles. So please, again, I don't want to spread misinformation, but correct me if I'm wrong, and I couldn't find any information that said otherwise, because they don't have enough biomass and organic soil to grow food there, and they were going through extreme food shortages. So I just want to mention, this is the last thing. So GMOs, I think that they cause ecosystem disruptions, or potential for ecosystem disruptions, when we purchase GMO seeds. One of the main reasons is Monsanto is a really bad company. They genetically modify seeds so they don't keep reproducing new seeds. So let's say that you have all of these fruits and vegetables, and then all of a sudden there's complete economic collapse, civilization collapse. You can't even take those seeds from GMO stuff and then grow them and grow another tomato plant or another watermelon, because they make the seeds so they can't be regrown. A lot of people in India, it was like over 100,000, like so many people in India committed suicide because Monsanto created all these GMO seeds, and they got them into contracts where they had to continue to purchase those GMO seeds. And now, if you don't get the seeds, it's not like you can grow a whole bunch of wheat. And then like the people in Nepal, they don't use GMOs seeds where I was. They harvest all their rice and all their wheat and all their stuff, and then they use those seeds to grow food the next year. And they're able to be sustainable. And that's what this program is about. There's a lot of developing countries that once they get locked into those GMO contracts with some of the major corporations that are just in it for financial gain, they then have to have those shipments of seeds every year, all the time, just to grow stuff. They can't just save seeds from the next year and then regrow it. And then there's lawsuits and fines and penalties if they do. So it's a lot more complicated. I think GMOs help lower the amount of like maybe water certain plants need, and it might help in some ways, but I think it's similar to nuclear power plants. It's great it might help solve global warming, but then we have all this radiation to deal with. So I connect GMOs to nuclear power plants, and I don't support it, and I try my best to eat 100% organic. The main thing's just ecosystem disruptions. You have some GMO seeds mixing in with the natural ecosystems, and it's like we already have so much ecosystem collapse around the world. That's my take on that and my input for this conversation.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
we
Definitely.
disagree, but thanks for your input,
Thank you.
Donald.
Thank you. I think we have our new guest. I think yes.
Oh, good. Yeah,
And-
let me just say one thing. It's not true that GMO seeds are sterile and that you can't reproduce them. It's just simply not true. And you can
Did you
look
take
that
any
up.
horticulture classes? I've taken multiple horticulture classes.
I have looked this up so many times. That isn't true. In fact, India, according to The Economist, the wheat in India is something like 40% of the genes from the Monsanto. They've been crossbreeding it there forever, and so it's just simply. I don't know where the myth came from, but that's just a myth.
We have our first disagreement.
Okay.
I'll eat organic. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Annie. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic with the GMO. And I really, as somebody who has spent a lot of years working on farms, I appreciate Donald's input around how technology is easing the burden for a lot of people. And at the same time, we need to come at farming from a multifaceted approach, like many hands make light work. If we are enabling a culture to be to not have a relationship with the natural world, whether that is first world or developing countries, it doesn't matter. We are and from nature. Yeah, I will kind of just clarify a couple of the things I've brought up, like permaculture and biodynamics that Alex mentioned, and also want to bring up desertification, because the only biome, like a region of a specific type of environment in the world that is growing is deserts. And that has been a steady truth since the dawn of agriculture, since the Fertile Crescent was turned into a desert because of the way we're still growing food now. So in 10,000 years, we haven't really learned much, apparently. And we're just continuing to try to solve the problem with the same thinking that created it, which Albert Einstein said is called insanity. So deserts are growing. We can, I recommend checking out greeningthedesertproject.org. This is a permaculture approach to reversing desertification. And this is a huge part of addressing famine in countries, especially like the continent of Africa, that is the largest continent that has the highest amount of famine. And the growing deserts, people are doing projects to stop the spread of the Sahara Desert by planting trees. And this would kind of merge with growing food as well. And once you have an established space with more vegetation, it can actually change the climate in that local region, inviting more precipitation with a positive feedback loop. So typically with food forests, a food forest is a forest that provides food for humans, which hundreds of years ago from indigenous North Americans, most of North America was a food forest. This is an approach that can address carbon sequestration. It can address food shortages. It can address erosion of topsoil. It addresses many different issues with one solution that is, once again, regional specific. So if people have been introduced to the concept of permaculture, that term was coined by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren out of Australia. It means permanent agriculture, but it also ripples out into society, how we interact culturally. For example, in the US, moving from rugged individualistic thinking to more collectivist thinking, where we think about the whole instead of the individual. So permaculture is taking indigenous knowledge of that specific region and applying it to scale with consideration of climate change, the climate emergency. So I mentioned almonds earlier, like in California, they can be dry farmed. Dry farming is a thing. So you're using less water and you have a specific technique where you can create a crust over the top layer of soil, trapping the moisture in lower. So tomatoes can be dry farmed. They're doing that in the Monterey Bay, and almonds are being dry farmed.
How does that technique work? Dry farming? How do you create that layer?
So that's not a specialty of mine,
really interesting.
but you heavily water at the beginning of a season, and then you make sure you don't disrupt the top layer of the soil so that it can form like a crust. And that hardened crust traps the moisture in underneath, and you don't really have to water as much moving forward into the season.
Because they try wood chips and stuff to do something similar. So there's a new technique. I wasn't aware of that. Cool. I'll do some keyword searches later. That's interesting.
Dry farming is a technique. Sheet mulching and adding mulch is also something that should be done, because you are, once again, sequestering carbon. We need to thin the forests and create healthy forests by interacting with them. And we can take the mulch from forests and create topsoil again, just by putting it in between the plants, and that will decrease evaporation of water. It's like putting mulch around the plants is like putting a blanket on it, so it prevents the water from just evaporating. Yeah.
Okay, but Enrique, I think that you want to share something, but you have a lot of internet problems. I'm sorry about that. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of internet problems. It's only about 2 points, and then I must leave because I have a lot of internet problems, as you can see. It's not very funny on my part, and I'm sure it's not very funny on your part either. The first one is regarding debt reduction and similar. I think we need to think bigger. We need to think on the way our monetary system is designed, so it is working in the manner. So it is working in the manner in which our planet is working. So we aren't overusing our resources. Can you hear me, or are you losing me?
You can continue.
Because I lost you there for a moment. Secondly, regarding, I'm all for GMOs, where GMOs can help increase the nutrients of the challenge. Let's see here.
Yes. Enrique, can you hear me? Okay, Professor Donald, I think that you want to add.
Well, I think it's great to do those kinds of techniques. I don't really, on this particular topic, I defer to people who actually, like Annie, who actually do the growing. But when it comes to the debt, I have I think Enrique was starting to say that we have to think bigger and do more than just forgive the debt. I think that if you look at the countries where there's real starvation and people are doing really poorly, they're all basically kleptocracies. They've got, even if they have resources and they use the resources, a small group of people will control the resources, and it doesn't help at all. The one thing I do want to point out is that the Chinese are actually investing a huge amount in Africa. They're building dams, they're building infrastructure, they're building transportation. They're actually based, and Africa now is growing food that's shipped to China because they're basically creating, and I doubt they're doing it in the most sustainable possible way, but they're, at least somebody is doing something in Africa. But as long as the governments are so unstable and there's so many wars going on, it's going to be difficult to feed everybody.
Okay, thank you. Enrique, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Blasted
I will be
internet.
quick. I'm sorry to read. The first one was that, blasted in. The first one was the IP rights. This can force small farmers into a debt relationship with the provider of the seeds, especially if the government has a deal with the company in question to only buy their seeds. So in that regard, the market is moving smaller farmers towards bankruptcy and towards uncertain employment in cities. The aspect, aspect is
I'm really sorry that he trying to add because of internet problems. I think that he cannot share. Yes,
yeah,
Enrique.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So sorry, one law. I will go later on because I think this is not funny, and I think that this is not providing the audience with the kind of help they need. But my last point is that we must be wary when we are the areas where we have to. So let's see here.
Mhm. Yes, I'm really sorry. Mr. Alex and Annie, what do you want to add specifically, the different kind of innovations and yeah.
Uh,
Okay, so
sorry,
yeah, I'll go ahead and cover some of that.
Enrique, can you hear me?
the last. Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, can you share
My
or
last point would be that Jevons paradox. Can you hear me?
yes,
Yeah.
Can you hear me, guys?
yes, yes.
Yeah, good. Jevons, when we moved, we created more efficient technology that allowed us to grow food tremendously. And when we started to utilize in the Amazon, we all know how it went. So maybe we should have a global ecological budget ceiling that limits how much we may take out from our planet. That was my last point. I thank you all for your time, and I apologize for my bad internet connection. I'm going to
Okay, no
beat
problem.
up my router really bad.
Okay.
But take care,
Okay.
everyone. Have a
Okay,
nice
okay.
day.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm sorry
Thank
I have
you.
to go,
Thank
but yeah.
Okay,
You're
okay,
welcome.
okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Just briefly, I remember one technology that's been very, very helpful, the cell phone, because
Mhm.
now farmers are able to actually call somebody in town and ask, well, how much is this selling for? And that gives them a lot more power over the middleman. And so cell phones have been very, very, as a technology. And of course, they can even transfer money that way, M-Pesa and things like that. So it's a way for them to find out at least and have negotiating power for what the stuff actually costs. That's
Mhm.
all. I just wanted to remind
Yes.
everybody of that because that's important.
Exactly. Exactly. Mr. Alex.
That's so interesting that Donald just said that, because that's exactly what I was going to say when it came to, well, not exactly. When it comes to innovation, I was just going to say that our internet's better than it's ever been. More people have the internet around the world than they have 1 year ago or 10 years ago. Internet could be your cell phone, looking at your cell phone screen. So that we have access to internet, and we constantly talk about how important education is, not just with solving climate change, but all the categories and subcategories of solving climate change. We could access all of this through the worldwide internet, but it takes, again, our individual initiative to realize that's important. Not thinking like, am I hungry now, or am I going to be hungry next week? But what are things going to be like in 1 year from now, and 5 years from now? How are food insecurities going to increase? Do you want to have food? Do you want to be resilient to the food insecurities we'll see in the future? So that takes individual initiative, making a list of things to do, what you want to research, getting online, doing keyword searches. Knowing about those keyword searches are really important. Going back to this video and watching we're at timestamp 141. Some really good keyword searches are biodiversity, monocropping, companion cropping, biodynamics that Annie was talking about, organic farming, doing the research. And I was saying, don't go with GMOs, research GMOs and the advantages. Doing more keyword searches like hydroponics, very important. Aquaponics, very important. Type in the environmental impact of beef versus chicken, or search Time Magazine, How Rabbits Can Save the World. There's a great article about how low their carbon footprint is. Research how to capture what rainwater, watershed, like Annie mentioned. There's also this underground network under the soil. It's called mycorrhiza, I think. Maybe Annie can correct me. So it's this whole network. When we continue to dump chemical fertilizers and fossil fuel derived everything on the soil, it depletes it, so it doesn't sequester carbon. So that's another thing, like keyword searches, carbon sequestration. In Santa Cruz, we're starting to do a composting program. The county is. So countywide, they're now implementing a countywide composting program, to where instead of us just turning in our trash with our trash cans and our recyclables, they're starting to transition to capturing or collecting our compostable material. So that's another step that our county is taking for carbon sequestration and sustainability. So another thing to research on the internet is WikiHow. I love WikiHow. I mean, I always talk about this. So you type in Wiki how to plant a tree, Wiki how to start a community garden, Wiki how to propagate seeds, Wiki how to save seeds, Wiki how to eat organic. I mean, there's just so many good tips on WikiHow, especially when it comes to growing your own food. Another keyword search, or something that you can search about, something that's really important and I think could be sustainable if we don't if within balance, a lot of things are within balance, is foraging. I'm sure Annie is forage. We live in a region where there's a lot of things that we could walk in nature, a lot of things that are edible, and that has to do with not taking these resources beyond their ability to replenish, or whether it's 10 people or 100 people taking those resources. So it's okay to take a couple berries here, an apple there, and some plants, and there's just a lot of cool stuff here, like stinging nettles are edible, and different things and plants that we consider weeds, or the majority of the population in my community considers it weeds, but they're actually edible. So foraging, there's books on foraging, so you can get these online. You can download some of the PDF documents. So for my region, I live in Santa Cruz in California. I would search to find a book, California native plant foraging, and you would learn about some of the native plants. So when I am in nature, you have that ability. And I think it will help us reconnect with nature, with the ecosystems, and realize what goes into making plants and growing food and all that. So farmers markets, I try to support farmers markets here. I think those are really important to support. Annie's worked at a farmers market. I've seen her there years and years in a row. It's just a good group of people that are genuinely growing good food and nutritious food for the public. Most of it's whole foods. It's not processed. There's not fillers and chemicals and preservatives and all this other stuff they dump in food. So supporting farmers markets, I think, is really important in the developed countries, like where I live, but other countries that I've been to, Iraq, the Philippines, Costa Rica. There's other markets that are just the market, but it's like farmers markets where they're just selling a lot of fruits and vegetables. So I'd recommend supporting those. Annie mentioned how we got to thin the forest, and here we do in California, because we have so much combustible material, so much fuel from when California used to have a higher rainfall. So now we have all these trees, we're in a drought, and we've been seeing a lot of forest fires, and they've been increasing year after year. This year was a horrible year for forest fires. Just so many structures were destroyed. All of that carbon's now in the atmosphere. Mechanical thinning is a technique where you go in, even though chainsaws use fossil fuels, you go in with chainsaws, machetes, literally like rakes and shovels and hose and all this equipment with like volunteers, sometimes firefighters, and they clean the forest up. So it gives the bigger trees a chance to grow, to sequester carbon better. It helps with the biodiversity. It solves all these problems, but then it goes to the dump, or it can. Sometimes they just put it in piles and burn it, which is not sustainable. But they can take it to the dump, they can grind it, they can turn it into compost and reintroduce it into the soil. That, again, helps with carbon sequestration. So there's ways to do these techniques sustainable. So I do want to mention that I've been through 7 hurricanes. I've covered the aftermath of 5 major hurricanes in different places around the world. When I went to Costa Rica after Hurricane Maria, I traveled to this, I went to Costa Rica, and then I went on this boat, this ferry. It was like the first ferry to this little island called Vieques. I was there for 2.5 months. I went with 2 volunteers I got in Costa Rica. So we were on a humanitarian mission, and we helped people and did food. And it was like a week and a half after Hurricane Maria. It was horrible and it was devastating. So I was shocked when I was there that everything was so lush and green, and it was so tropical, but there was like nobody was growing their own food. I saw like one little tiny farm, and I kept asking, like, why aren't you guys growing more of your own food? There was so many food shortages there, but they just like weren't prepared. I was shocked. So there's a lot of countries that have the ability to grow food, but Vieques had like no farms, and there wasn't like community gardens, and there was like some trees here and there, but nothing major. So during that disaster, they were completely dependent on regional or international aid to come in and help them. If they had gardens, they would be more self-sufficient and resilient when it came to hurricanes. So I think that there's other areas around the world that have a Mediterranean climate, such as where I live in Santa Cruz, or tropical climates, and they should take advantage of growing their own food and not be so dependent on the global food transportation system. I do want to mention it's another big topic that's worth researching is us just trying to avoid palm oil because they are cutting down so many forests worldwide. They're not doing it sustainable. There are sustainable organizations and ways that you can purchase palm oil sustainably, but it's just in so much of our food and it's a filler and it's destroying ecosystems, and it's a good thing to know about. Homeowners associations are a huge problem in the United States, and it's like a group of houses and like an organization that limits people from growing their own food because they want the green lawn and everything to look perfect. It's ridiculous. We're going through ecological collapse. We're in a climate emergency, and we need to transition away from these laws and these red tapes and these homeowner associations that allows people to grow food on their property. And that's a huge problem, and it's just disgusting that there's like these high class people in the United States and different places around the world that are stopping and limiting people from growing their own food. And it's frustrating every time I think about it, of course. So
Thank you.
that's my input for this one. Yeah.
Thank you. Annie. Thank you, Annie.
Awesome, Alex. Yeah, I agree. I was just completed the book White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg about the real history of the United States and how it's basically been implemented into the structure when the suburbs were first being developed in the 50s, that you got low points. You got low points on appraisals if you were growing food. And when people were out there, some white guy doing the original appraisals for the suburbs in LA, all the major cities, if you had non-edible landscaping, you get high points. If you have any food growing, you got the lowest points because they want to discourage anything that represents a lower class. And so I'm very interested in the intersectionality between classism, racism, white supremacy, and food, because there is a lot of overlap with these social issues. And it's really hard to solve a problem unless we're considering the whole. I definitely wanted to mention Vandana Shiva because we were talking about like GMOs, and she is a political activist from India. And I had the privilege to work at her farm very briefly when I was in India years ago, but her farm is called Navdanya. And she is very active to help people of India go back to their traditional ways of farming. And because suicide rates have gone up and up and up, somewhat in response to what Alex was mentioning about Monsanto and these larger companies coming in and monopolizing a certain way of farming. And it makes it very difficult for smaller farmers. So she's awesome. Yeah, and I actually didn't get into biodynamics, but biodynamics it's like a more specific way of farming than even permaculture. Permaculture is like this structure that can be applied to the local region, and biodynamics is a specific methodology from Europe that incorporates, it's like somewhat spiritual, but it also incorporates the more subtle nuances of how to plant that can really optimize the nutritional value of a plant and the resilience of a plant once it's planted in the ground. So biodynamics, it definitely works, and I recommend looking into that too. It's also can be regional specific. Yeah, and I think we haven't touched too much on fungi. Alex brought up mycorrhizae, but the fungus is the connection between, fungus helps connect plants to the soil, because that mycorrhizae will help the roots of plants be able to absorb nutrients, and there's often symbiotic relationship between fungi in the soil plants and the stability of the soil and the ability to sequester carbon. And Paul Stamets is a person from the northwest of the United States who is an expert on fungi. He's a mycologist, and fungi can adapt so quickly that that organism can actually be trained. So we can train them. Scientists are working on training certain types of fungus to be able to break down certain types of plastic and oil, for example, so that it's breaking it down and actually changing those components into a different substance that's less harmful for the environment. So I highly recommend utilizing Paul Stamets, his organization Fungi Perfecti, as a resource that once again can be regional specific, the specific types of species of fungus. And speaking of protein, as Alex brought up with rabbits, I do eat meat. I think that nutrition is a very personal thing. Whatever somebody's bodily composition needs is very personal. And at the same time, everybody needs protein and fat. So with protein, mushrooms are one of the most efficient ways to get protein. And you can grow a large amount of calories and protein in a small amount of space, almost anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Actually, we get a lot of information about agriculture, agricultural process, how we can solve hunger-related things, supply chain management, different good policy. Mm-hmm. So we want to arrange this kind of discussion more in the futures. So we have more sessions this week. So we want to invite both of you in our sessions. Hopefully your contributions actually enrich our audience, and by this way we can develop different things. World Talent Economy Forums, Asia Research and Development Institute, and Al Noor Academy, we are working together for developing a better ecosystem with the help of government, corporations, and academia. So your contributions will help us a lot, and definitely we will develop different projects in Asia Pacific. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. First, I want to start with Mr. Alex, then Annie. Yes.
So I wanted to emphasize, I apologize. Sometimes I talk fast and I try to cover a lot of material. I hope people listen to some keywords that I use and they search it later or do more research on some of those specific keywords. I want to emphasize something that I've mentioned a couple times throughout the subject of food production, sustainability. So on a large scale, if we're looking at this from an extremely large perspective, we are depleting the soils around Earth. So that's causing, like Annie said, deserts to grow. So we're depleting the soils because we're continuing to grow food and extract food and grow food. So every time we extract food, we waste the food, we eat the food. It's taking all of those nutrients and all of that organic matter out of the soil. So what composting is, or mechanically thinning forest and reintroducing that into the soil and mixing it helps with carbon sequestration. So we need to continue to keep the layers and a thick layer of soil to help sequester carbon, so we can continue to grow good organic food with good high nutrient content, so we can be healthy, feel good, be prosperous. It helps our society. It helps us think better, be smarter, feel better about ourselves, and just feel good. Just eating good food, organic food. So again, I just want to emphasize this. So we need to keep reintroducing organic matter into the soil and grow organic food. If we keep being dependent on the fossil fuel industry and keep making synthetic fertilizers and keep dumping synthetic fertilizers to grow the food, or spraying all of it with synthetic insecticides, rodenticides, things that kill insects, things that kill rodents, things that kill mildew, all of these different chemicals, all of that is going into the soil, depleting the soil, and it's eventually running into the groundwater, running into the creeks, into the rivers, and it's increasing the acidity of the ocean and causing aquatic die-off and all these other consequences. Other insects are eating this and dying, whether it's the bees and other stuff. It's causing ecosystem disruptions. The birds and the other animals that eat this, and we're putting this in our bodies. We're putting all these chemicals into our bodies. It's polluting everything. So that's why I support organic agriculture. That's why I compost everything that I can. And again, so we're depleting Earth's crust, and we need to continue to replace that, and we got to do that sustainably for carbon sequestration to solve climate change. And it's just a huge topic, and we're not doing things the right way. And again, that's why deserts are increasing and why we're seeing increase in global temperatures, because carbon sequestration and how we vote with our money and the food that we eat and making the choice to grow some of our food is such a huge solution. So thanks again, Sharif, for this time, this discussion, the panel, and thanks again for all of our viewers. And hopefully you can benefit from this, and please share these videos so this important information reaches more people. Thank you, Sharif.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Annie. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sharif, for hosting this discussion and all the other discussions and work that you're doing. It's super important, and I really am honored to be introduced to you and this organization. Yeah, I think my final comment would just be that understanding that this global situation with food security and the climate emergency can be extremely overwhelming to our nervous system, to an individual person, to feel like they are responsible for helping. And so if there's a takeaway for someone watching this, I hope that they know that the world's going to be fine. Mother Earth has actually gone through much more extremes in a lot of ways, but that we should pay attention to what feels good and why are we on the planet in this time? What feels good as a response to this awareness that we have? And every little thing that we can do is helpful. And thanks to the internet and lots of other developments, we do have access to a lot of information. And if we can work together with our neighbors, it can actually be easy, fun work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Actually, World Talent Economic Forums, we do more focus on sustainability. So even 17 goals, we are working on that particular points. So I can understand both of you have very good contributions on that particular points. So we are very happy that you joined with us. We have a lot of like not only discussion, we are taking a lot of initiative in between our local community. So your contributions, both of your contribution really help us. And I want to give special thanks to our audience, those who really support us. And I request everyone share this kind of content as much as possible. By this way, you can learn many things. You can learn different aspects and different information, which will be very much important for different countries as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining today's. Thank you.
Thank you.